Hi everyone, thank you for coming to my talk today, which is called Resistant Fragility, Brotherhoods of Conservative Men in Contemporary North America. My name is Dr. Mick Brewer, and I'm an assistant professor of communication studies at Lincoln University in Missouri. So what this talk is going to cover today is really broadly looking at the connections between the sort of current status of our political arena in the United States as it is led and represented by Donald Trump, and the relational norms, the friendships, the same-sex friendships, which from here on out I will be referring to as homosocial, meaning the same gender, same-sex pairing in friendships, the norms within those friendships of Trump supporters, young male Trump supporters. So if you don't mind, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So that you all can have a visual as we move through this talk. I'm going to try to keep this talk to roughly an hour or so, maybe a little less, we'll see. I'm going to open up the talk with a quote that was from a journalistic piece a couple of years ago, and it kind of sort of gets at the heart of today's talk and more broadly the issues that I will be discussing. And so this journalist says, "I'm not sure that any president over the past half century was as perversely insistent on his manhood, as narrow in his definition of it, and as superficially fixated on brute strength as the Oval Office's current occupant is. And what a shame, because we're struggling right now to forge a healthier sexual dynamic between men and women and to stop young men from exploding violently. We sorely need a better and more nuanced model of masculinity." And I think that really gets at the core of so much of what this talk is about and where my research has taken me over the past 3 or so years. Today's talk is actually coming out of research that I did for my PhD dissertation, which I defended and completed last year. And the project that I did for my dissertation, it was really driven by a number of things. One of them being, I felt as though Trump's ascension in the political arena, one of the things that we were really overlooking a lot was the gendered component. We fixated a lot on Trump's racial or arguably racist rhetoric. That was something that mainstream audiences and media institutions really latched onto, was the I think, quite viscerally and unequivocally racist discourse and rhetoric that he relied on and has continued to rely on. So race and this sort of racial aggression and this conjuring up support from hate groups where the focal point was racism, that really gained a lot of traction. But gender, while Trump has been slammed for being sexist and misogynistic and whatnot over the years, I really felt like a more critical, nuanced, in-depth look at the gendered logics and dynamics that gave way to Trump's rise was something that was really neglected. Another thing that I thought was really important in this larger equation of trying to understand the relevance of Trump and how someone so divisive, someone so atypical could land the presidency position was the base of supporters who put them there. And not only the base of supporters, but what are sort of their behaviors, their norms, their communicative practices in the everyday, because I think so many people were sort of confounded and dumbfounded as to how and why Trump, given all of what has been said about him, what has been revealed about him, all of the things he has revealed about himself in terms of being the sort of seeming bully and aggressive, sexist person, how is it that someone who has all of these, what many of us would consider to be very severe character flaws, still wind up getting the vote, even if he did lose the popular vote, of course, by over 3 million people, as we know, it's infamously known. I think the question that so many people had was, how could you vote for someone who embodied and demonstrated those kinds of characteristics. There's a disconnect there between those behaviors and an ability to support those behaviors for many of us. And the question for me was, as a social scientist, as a communication scholar, was obviously in some way the behaviors that he is embodying and the things that he is saying are not offensive to everybody. And perhaps they are normalized for many people. And if that's the case, we need to dig a bit deeper and understand what are the norms of the people who found positivity, found something meaningful in Trump and his performance of self, in his performance of leadership, in his performance of masculinity, and the rhetoric and discourse he relied upon and perpetuated in support of that. So today's talk is divided up into roughly 8 kind of sections, and I will try to seamlessly guide you through the talk. I'm going to start by addressing Trump's ascendance very briefly. There's no need to rehash, I think, what has been discussed a lot, but going to briefly talk about Trump's ascendance and his support base, the people who demographically put him into the position that he is in now. Then I'm going to sort of piggyback from that into a brief conversation where we can think about the relationship between gender and the nation, national identity and gender identity, and how those two things are very much mutually intertwined in ways that sort of show how things happening to and within the nation are also, they are emblematic and indicative of changes that are happening in gender, and they might necessitate new approaches to how we do gender and vice versa. Then I'm going to move that into a discussion on Trump's performance of gender, as it has been speculated and written about from various perspectives. And then I will use that introductory sort of talk to move into the study that resulted in the data that I'm talking about today. And in that part, I will talk about the research questions, some of the research questions that drove the initial study, the interest in it. I'll talk about some of the theory that went into shaping how I approached the study, how I approached the participants, and how I approached my sort of coding and categorizing and theorizing of the data. And then I will spend the rest of the time talking about the, so to speak, findings of the study and sort of what that means in terms of the relationship between relational and communicative norms within the same-sex friendships of Trump supporters and the larger political landscape that we're in right now. And I will talk specifically about 2 things. One, insult humor and the significance of that and the different kind of logics that it relies on and perpetuates as it relates to gender and the nation. And then I will move into a discussion of locker room talk and talk about how it seems in the contemporary era, younger people, younger men specifically, are looking at locker room talk in new kind of ways, in part thanks to Trump and his rhetoric of locker room talk. And then I will round out the talk by discussing what this sort of means in the current moment of racial unrest, of COVID, and what are the connections between relational norms of young conservative men and, let's say, the anti-mask movement, for example, seeing that as a site of resistance. So to kick us off, and let me just pause 1 second here. I just want to make sure that I am in fact recording. Let's see here. Okay, I am. Don't want any. I don't want to present this whole thing and then have it turn out not be recorded, of course. So Trump and his original sort of ascension, how did he come to be president? He relied on a rhetoric that was very similar to Nixon in the late 60s, the silent majority rhetoric, this idea that there is a silent population of people in this country whose voices are being silenced and being suppressed in service of liberal ideology and the sort of perceived stranglehold, right, that the liberal elite left had on the country, on its policies, on its leadership, on its governance, and on its cultural norms, right? And Trump really tapped into that, I think, far more than way more than Nixon did. He not only tapped into this idea of the silent majority, but he really propped up so much of his rhetoric and his campaign on this sort of fear-mongering and propaganda that the left are these sort of arbiters and gatekeepers of every part of the cultural and political domain. And he created, you know, lots of very egregious, erroneous statements, and has continued to do so, as we've seen in the COVID era, about just how pervasive and powerful the liberal left ideology and regime is. And so he really tapped into that. And as is so often the case in these situations, you go for the most vulnerable people in terms of conjuring up these fears, the most impressionable people, really. And so when you look at the people who were overwhelmingly supportive of Trump, you see a huge disparity in education. For example, Trump's biggest support bases come from non-urban areas, from rural areas, among people who aren't very educated, who are less educated than supporters of Clinton were. He also had a huge base in areas where manual labor, manufacturing jobs, blue-collar work is common. And of course, within those sorts of spaces, geographically and culturally, you begin to see a very specific kind of patterned norms, ideologically, culturally, behaviorally, logically, operating within those spaces. And Trump is very aware of that. And so he spoke to those people. And he relied on things, discourses, tropes, narratives, myths, tactics that would speak to and resonate with those people. In terms of race and gender, 58% of white voters, who make up almost 70% of the overall voting pool in the United States, voted for Trump, compared to only 37% for Hillary. So you see almost 60% of white folks voting for Trump in 2016. And non-white voters, who make up about 31% of the voting total, voted for Trump, and 74% for Clinton. So you see very clearly there, intersectionally, yes, a lot of white men and women, white men specifically, voted for Trump. That was his biggest participant pool. 63% of white men, in fact, voted for Trump, compared to only 31% for Clinton, with 53% of white women voting for Trump and 43% for Clinton. So these are statistics that we are all very well aware of at this point, but it is important, I think, to have that reminder of who he was speaking to and for. The Trump voter, you know, there's a lot of talk about the Trump voter. And I will be honest, another driving interest and really frustration in my original desire for this study to pursue conservative men and Trump supporters for my dissertation project was because of this ongoing and with ease critique of anyone who was a Trump supporter by members of the left. And Hillary Clinton very famously did this, and I think it really hurt her when she referred to them notoriously as baskets of deplorables, right? Where you were making these sweeping generalizations about anyone simply because they voted for this one person. And logically, and I think in terms of my own personal, I don't know, emotional side, I guess you could say, I was quite frustrated by that. I found it reductive. I found it overly essentialist. And I found that kind of approach and mentality to be very guilty of many of the things that a lot of liberals, especially the ones who are making those critiques, claim to rally against. And of course, the left is very much prone to being called hypocrites on a regular basis. You know, just this week, Nancy Pelosi was filmed being in a hair salon without a face mask on. And she's kind of positioned herself as this sort of COVID warrior, right? And so we have another moment in which the left opens itself up to critiques of hypocrisy. And I was admittedly, I felt very strongly about that as well. And so I initially had a lot of problems with this tendency to overgeneralize Trump supporters, that they were all bad, they were all deplorables, because in doing so, it negates a lot of the realities for Trump supporters. It negates something like class, which the left, and particularly liberal elites, oftentimes overlook. Academics overlook it a lot. Academics are overwhelmingly liberal, especially in the humanities, and they overlook class a lot. They want to shirk discussions of class and economic privilege. I am in the academy, I see it a lot. And that is a growing critique of the academic libs, especially from younger academics. And so I was very annoyed by these tendencies, and I thought there's got to be something more here. We also tended to conflate the most radical and extremist forms of Trump supporters with everyone, and seeing them as being an umbrella representation of all Trump supporters. So for example, the alt-right, which are these very outlier, sort of smaller enclave. And to be very clear, the alt-right occupies a very, 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 very marginal percentage of the Trump base. Very marginal. You know, we're talking less than 5%. Is it important to note that his rhetoric resonates with these extremist groups? It absolutely is, and that should not be discounted, and that should be examined. But it also should not be used as a logic to prop up the idea that sort of deductively we can say that all Trump supporters feel this way, and that they are therefore taking the same thing or getting the same thing out of his message as those people are. So if we look at the Trump voter, this was a study that came out, I think, the year following his election win, and it broke down, generally speaking, 5 different typologies of Trump supporters. So the staunch conservative, occupying 31%, or the biggest part of his base, which are very fiscally conservative, embrace more traditionalism, and have more of a nativist conception of American identity and immigration. Then we have free marketeers, which are small government fiscal conservatives. They have a little bit more moderate to liberal positions on immigration and social issues. Then we have the American preservationists, which are more economically progressive, and have this sort of suspicion that the systems are rigged, which again, Trump really played into that idea, especially with the drain the swamp mentality and that rhetoric. And then the anti-elites, also economically progressive, but also that the systems are rigged, and has more moderate to liberal-ish leanings on immigration, American identity, social issues. And then lastly, the disengaged, so about 5%, so very small. And these are the people who are mostly unfamiliar with from the general political system. And I think this is the group where a lot of people sort of touted the idea of Trump as president as fun. They thought it was entertaining. They aren't really invested in politics to begin with, because either they see it as boring or not for them, or they just are deeply suspicious of the political system because they know their realities and they understand how it has failed them. It's hard to believe in the rhetoric of a political leader, whether it's left or right, conservative, liberal, whatever, when you have seen no measured changes or drastic changes in your own living conditions, election cycle after election cycle. And so there's just a deep suspicion and sort of dismissiveness towards those institutions. And so this idea is that you're just disengaged because you don't see it as relevant to you. It's not of interest to you. And so the idea of Trump becoming president, you don't really care. And you think, well, hell, it's funny, it's whatever. And so admittedly, that group is smaller though. So what are some of the connections between Trump's ascension, between Trump as a president, between the position of president and gender? Given that this is a project that focuses largely on gender and situates it within the crosshairs of analysis, it's important to draw connections between the nation and between gender. So I posed this question here that you can see on the screen. How is the nation masculinized, and how is masculinity nationalized? Now, we could sort of switch that out and say, how is the nation feminized, and how is femininity nationalized. But given that this is a project that was focusing on self-identified, overwhelmingly biologically born men who identify as masculine, I'm focusing here on masculinity, and it's also relevant, of course, when we talk about the system and structure of gender as it relates to the nation. Newsflash, we've only elected men to lead our country, to be the symbolic and legislative figureheads and representatives of our country. So when we talk about nation and gender, we clearly have, operating within a patriarchal system, a much higher level of comfort with men and seeing the nation as a masculine pursuit and as a thing that should be protected by masculine subjects. So that's why we're talking about masculinity here. And if you look historically, and I've got some examples here of just more contemporary or historically semi-recent presidents here, thinking about Reagan, thinking about Bush, thinking about Obama, and sort of the masculine presence and performance that each of them had. And we could throw in Clinton in there for good measure. And we can see very clearly this sort of profile developing where more liberal-leaning men have a particular kind of masculine performance and presence versus more conservative men. I think if we look at Reagan and Bush, for example, you see very similar styles of ethos there. And yes, that shows through in their policies and how they approach their policies. And I think that manifests and intensifies depending upon what happens within or to the nation while under their respective control. So for example, if we look at Bush, in the post 9/11 sort of catastrophe, his discourse and his sort of rhetoric began to change a little bit. I reference here a study that illuminated that Bush had sort of a two-pronged set of communicative tactics in a post 9/11 public discourse. And that was one, his ability to reconstruct nations of salient masculinity by presenting his views as clear, objective, and definitely decided or definitive. And then two, by having various masculine themes within the discourse, including those related to strength, fortitude, and firmness. So these are words that he would rely on in his speeches when he would address the nation, and interviews that would sort of reestablish the United States in this very traditionally masculine way. The United States had been under siege, had been threatened, and the way to sort of restore its position in the world was to reinforce its masculine dimensions, and to do that relying on some of the most fundamentally traditional, if dated, notions and terms for describing and assigning to masculinity. And interestingly enough, in my participant interviews with the participants of my study, which I'll get to that in a little bit, this idea of fortitude and firmness and strength, when I would ask them to describe Donald Trump, to give me some adjectives, those were some words that they would use to describe him. Now, on the other hand, we look at presidents like Obama or Clinton, and they have this decidedly more sort of laid back, smooth set of masculine tones, where there is a more feminine slant to them. So for Obama, for example, very liberal leaning, of course, in terms of his ideology and the policies that stemmed from those ideologies. Progressivism, for some, is seen as emasculating and as a feminizing thing, because conservatism is in many ways an act or a rhetoric of gatekeeping, of traditionalism. And when we talk about gatekeeping and traditionalism, we're also talking about power and hierarchies. And so in so many ways, liberalism, democratic parties, and sort of even anything that's not conservative really, I would say is really rooted in the desire to destabilize or deconstruct those power dynamics and those power hierarchies. And so that can be seen as emasculating, because gender and masculinity specifically, one of the ways that it maintains its power and maintains its currency in a patriarchal world is to enact and perform a certain set of characteristics that differentiate oneself from the feminine, and not only to differentiate oneself, but to make one inferior and superior. So somebody like Obama that was wanting to dismantle hierarchies, that can be seen as emasculating. He was also an openly avowed feminist. the first president that we've ever had to be openly feminist, which that obviously very much counters more hyper-masculine discourses that rely on notions of endurance and strength and fortitude and firmness. It's a more feminine-oriented sensibility that relies on things like collaboration rather than competition. So we see that masculine performance, or that performance of gender as embodied by people like Trump or Bush, come through in their policies and the way they talk about the country, and in the ways in which we are sort of normalizing what it can mean in terms of the capacity or potentiality to be a man, right, in that position of power. We've also seen political movements in the past, such as the mythopoetic or mythopoetic men's movement of the late 80s and early 90s, which was, I think, at its peak was really best sort of captured by Robert Bly in his book Iron John, a book about men. And so the mythopoetic men's movement was this collective response nationally by men who felt like men were sort of under siege because of cultural change, because of shifts in ideology, shifts in gender norms, because of the feminist movement, that men were beginning to be repositioned and reframed in society in such a way that was damaging to them. And so this movement was geared towards men reconnecting with one another, of forming sort of the male equivalent of what we call consciousness raising groups of the second wave feminist movement in the 70s, where men would get together and really talk about their feelings, which again was very atypical in terms of what we teach men they should be and what they should be doing. It was really in many ways a side of for men to be vulnerable, to open up about their feelings of being swept under the rug or being under attack or under assault. And it was met with division. You had some people saying this was healthy. It was very cathartic for men to finally address the emotional dimensions of their manhood, while other people sort of dismissed it and said that it was just men who were scared because for the first time in a very, 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 very long time, they were being held accountable for behaviors and having some of their power robbed from them. And instead of seeing that as a good thing, they interpreted that as a personal assault. But historically, what this tells us is that there are deep connections between political figures that lead our country, the way that we sort of discursively produce and situate our nation, policies and legislation and cultural ebbs and flows that happen within our nation, and the ways in which those things impact our understandings of our gendered self. And so all of those things, we can then move into the present moment, that understanding of Trump's own performance of masculinity. If we understand connections between public leadership and their performance of gender as having an impact on and resonating with a voting constituency, or stepping up in the moment to a particular moment, such as Bush did with the post 9/11 movement, what does it say for us to elect someone like Donald Trump as president, who, as the quote that I referenced at the beginning of this presentation noted, embodies many of the most sort of aggressive forms of masculinity, when he is coming off of a presidential leader who embodied and performed and manifested through their legislation and policies the counter opposite of what Trump has and does. So if Obama is this sort of unapologetically black, cool, chill, as he's often referred to as in discourse and studies by voters, open, sort of vulnerable, emotional person, how do we go from that to Trump? And what was the reason for that transition? Because it's not arbitrary, right? Like, it's not arbitrary that we went from one extreme to another. So how has Trump been described in terms of his gender? There's lots of different approaches. I mean, the quick and short of it is none of them have been great. Very, very few, as specific to his notion of gender, very few reports or analyses have given him a glowing review. So one of the big ones is that there is he evidences a very big disconnect between hegemonically masculine ideals and his reality. So when we talk about hegemonic masculinity, This is an important concept that comes out of masculinity studies from the mid-1980s by a man named Robert Connell. And when we talk about hegemonic masculinity, we're talking about, when we say hegemonic, we're talking about sort of top of the totem pole hierarchy. To have hegemony is to have dominance. So dominant masculinity and the social scripts that tell us what it means to be the correct man. What does it mean to be the right form of a dominant man? And within the Western sphere, that typically means to be Caucasian, educated, white, aggressive, competitive, athletic, or have a history of athleticism, to be assertive, to be forthright, there's this idea of fortitude, but there's also this idea of performing and enacting any set of things that establishes your dominance, whether it's in the private or the public sphere. And so a lot of Trump's own performances seem to imply his own understanding that he does not level up to or match up to this hegemonically masculine man. And as is so often when we fail to measure up to something, he lashes out at people because he is trying to overcompensate, or he's dealing with his own insecurities. He has complexes. Trump is, for all intents and purposes, a bully. To be abundantly clear on where I stand on this, Trump is a bully, and he has made himself known to be a bully consistently for years and years and years, long before his tenure as president, long before his campaigning to be president. He has made himself a bully, presented himself and such. And as we know about bullying, so often it stems from a sense of defeat, a sense of insecurity, a sense of trying to clamor one's way to be accepted, to go from out group to in group. And we see that with Trump. So there's this larger notion that he understands that he has failed in some way, and he's trying to overcompensate from that in his words, in his performance, in his endless pursuit of power and the abuse of that power, his economic standing, etc. He's also been called a fantasy or a caricature or a parody of manhood and what it means. So in The Nation, a newspaper magazine publication in 2017, an author there wrote that Donald Trump expresses a, quote, violent fantasist who dreams of a physical supremacy he never achieved, and has then spent his life expressing this insecurity and hostility through boardroom bullying and, of course, sexually predatory behavior. He has lived his life in thrall to toxic masculinity, but lacked the ability to prove his manhood on the football field, and then dodged the armed forces, never attempting to prove his manhood on the battlefield. He has chosen instead to spend a lifetime tearing down the people who have dared stand in his path and the women who dared to say no. And I just want to make a note here. That was written in 2017, and I think it's important to pause and reflect and think, since those 3 years that statement has been published, in what ways has this proven true time and time and time and time again? It doesn't take long, right? Another publication, an author termed him a walking symbol of overdoing gender. He has been written as toxic, violent, and dangerous, as embodying this sort of frat boy masculinity, sort of embodying all of the most awful, repugnant domains and dimensions of what it means to be a man. Narcissistic, overly competitive, violently aggressive, dismissive, power hungry, abusive towards women and to those in inferior positions to him, taking zero accountability for his behavior and blaming people left and right. There's this tweet here that he tweeted, I think it was from 2017, maybe 2018, that I put on here that really kind of characterizes, I think, and illustrates a lot of the silliness of it all, but also the seriousness. And so he tweeted, North Korean leader Kim Jong-un just stated that the nuclear button is on his desk at all times. Will someone from his depleted and food-starved regime please inform him that I too have a nuclear button, but it is a much bigger and more powerful one than his, and my button works. So I think tweeting out something like that and the response that it gets is very divided. On one hand, you have his camp of, diligent, committed followers who think it's funny, but those are also the same kind of people, I think, who ask you to pull their finger and you do, and then they flatulate, and then that's what gives them a laugh. It's those kinds of people. versus the people who see that and they go, something is off here, right? Like, this is obviously a very amateur, juvenile approach, especially something or within the arena of something that is so serious as war. We're talking about nuclear weapons here, and we're relying on this sort of catty, you know, veiled rhetoric of incompetence and of impotence, right? Like, he is obviously relying on this like childish, juvenile comedy of the impotent penis, right? And he's putting that within the framework of national policy as it relates to nuclear arms, and on Twitter, no less. So he characterizes in many ways this very particular kind of manhood, and one that so many of us find deeply troubling and problematic. So I want to bring all of that into the study itself. And from here, we will talk about the specifics of the study and the results of the study. So as I noted, this project for me began in about 2017, and it was rooted in both a frustration about the ways that Trump supporters were being overgeneralized and the sort of ongoing thought that I had of just, surely they can't all be this bad. And the ones who aren't quote unquote bad eggs, or to use the language of Clinton, deplorables, how is it that they are able to sort of make excuses for behavior that I and many other people see as generally inexcusable? Because I know that how I digest and interpret and orient to Trump's behavior is filtered through the lens of my own experiences, my own identities and positions in this world. And I know that it also works that way for other people. So it's important, it was important for me to be reflexive and think about the lenses and experiences and identities and beliefs and ideologies that I am committed to, and how they act as a filtering mechanism for how I assess or decode Trump. But I also need to understand what kind of lenses and experiences are other people using, where they can see what he's doing and what he is as not awful. So it was driven by that, coupled with this larger concern or interest over, the people on the ground. What are the people on the ground seeing in Trump? A general question that I had was, what do Trump supporters see of themselves in Trump, and what of Trump do they see in themselves? Because there has to be a connection there. For Trump's most vigilant anti-supporters, there is a very explicit disconnect there, and we can articulate what that disconnection is. I was interested in what is the connection there, because I do think, to boil it all down to, what is called the white lash thesis, this idea that Trump won because a demographic, a generation of economically disadvantaged white people translated that disadvantagedness into racial rage and then relied on that to fuel Trump, and that Trump got in office simply because of racial rage. I don't buy into that. I think that's an important part of the puzzle, but I think liberals tend to over-rely on and overemphasize that particular part of the puzzle. So I wanted to know, what is the connection there between this more macro system represented by the president and the more micro everyday performances of gender and their norms? So some of the questions that I have, these are research questions for my original dissertation. What are the connections drawn between Trump's articulation of hegemonic masculinity and the modes of masculinity most salient within same-sex male friendships of his political supporters? What types of relational bonds do male Trump supporters commonly occupy, and what are the communicative, such as verbal and nonverbal, norms within those relationships? And then in what ways can micro-relational processes of male engagement and gender production among Trump supporters be connected to the larger, more macro-oriented patriarchal political system that the president sort of represents and gatekeeps? So I want to now move into a little bit of the theory, just to bring everyone up to speed, and a sort of Spark Notes quick version of my approach to this study. So as a communication studies scholar who got their PhD in communication studies and a master's in both communication studies and women, gender, and sexuality studies, I was approaching this project from a communication perspective. And so here on this screen, you'll see a couple of points related to this. So communicative approaches to gender. What does that mean? What does that look like? So from a communication perspective on gender, we're looking at this sort of performative, what we do with our body, how we use symbols and semiotics to articulate a gender, how we construct socially a gender through signs and embodied performances and ritual. Looking at rhetoric, how is it that we are using public and private rhetorics to build and sculpt a movement or a rhetoric of masculinity? What does that mean? What does that body look like? Again, the symbolic. How do we symbolically create gender, masculinity, manhood? What are all of the ways through our embodied way, verbal communication, nonverbal communication, emotions, behaviors, etc., do we create gender through our language and through our interaction? And this is a sort of semiotic and symbolic interactionist approach broadly to communication and gender, which is to say, when we talk about symbolic interactionism, this sociological idea that we really create the worlds that we live in through our interactions with each other. That is where we create rules and norms and systems. And it is a way in which we create our own subjectivity and subject formation in relation to other people. And it is through those symbolic and material arrangements with each other that we create material worlds. Also looking at gender from a discursive standpoint, a more post-structural, so this sort of deconstructive, where we don't see binaries, we don't see either or, black or white, male, female, where gender is not something that is incredibly concrete, but it is something that is circular, it's recursive, it's both a byproduct of and a contributor to larger cultural spheres and cultural conditions, where gender is not something that is rigid, where it's something that is made and remade again. To use the language and term of Judith Butler, a very famous gender theorist, it is citational in the sense that our only point of reference to doing gender is from what we have seen, and each new time we repeat or replicate or cite that existent performance, we keep it alive. So how is it that men are citationally reproducing gender in their friendships, and where are they learning those things? Another important thing I think I just wanted to touch on here is that so often when we say gender, we conflate that or associate that with women rather than men. But there is a real problem in that. And so when I talk about gender in this project, obviously I'm looking at men, because when we don't associate men with gender, when we say something like gender studies programs and just automatically associate it with women, it's reifying the male as being this sort of unquestioned and unmarked, all-encompassing gender. And if we look at something like gendered language, it's the same as saying something like layman, to use layman's language, or policeman, or using the word guys to address a mixed group of audience. When we say, hey guys, when there are men and women present, right, there's likely not guys in the room as well. So why do we automatically conflate or associate gender or groups with men? So it's important to draw attention to men when we talk about gender and say that men and masculinity is just as culpable and just as relevant within this as women are. This approach, so the study is looking at gender from a comm perspective, looking at these things as how gender is brought to life and performed and enacted non-verbally and verbally in their relationships, in this interactionist sort of position, which then draws on communication from a social perspective, which is where we center events and behaviors that occur between two or more people during the more micro interactional phase or process, rather than looking at something from a more group or a more hyper macro or a singular person's vantage. And so here we see situated interactions as they exist in the social world as a way to understand how realities are constructed and reproduced, and how interactions are both a sign of and reproducer of structural and cultural norms. And this is a more what we call a practical approach to theory, where we're looking at the quote unquote real. We're looking at the material world, the social world, and drawing from data to theorize things in ways that reflect reality, whatever that means. And also to hopefully generate from those theorizations and observations and analysis, things that can be practically and pragmatically useful for us beyond the silo and insulated world of the academy. Now, this study also is using critical theory, because one of the things inherently invested in and by this project was power dynamics. I'm looking at how is it that Donald Trump, as the sort of gatekeeper of masculine privilege, as he embodies and exemplifies many of the most powerful and aggressive and restrictive forms of manhood, what are the connections between him being put in that position of power and the people who elected him in that position of power? And how is it that the valorization of those characteristics are happening on the ground, so to speak? So it's inherently interested in power dynamics. Power dynamics within relationships, how those dynamics then move beyond those relationships to sustain and perpetuate existing power dynamics that disenfranchise some and privilege others. Particularly for this project, I'm looking at gender inequity, as I'll get to. So I'm using a lot of theory from interpersonal communication, because we are dealing with a overwhelmingly interpersonal phenomena here, the relationships of same-sex friendships of young male Trump supporters, looking at their interpersonal communication behaviors. And so I'm blending that with critical theory being this body of work, this body of theory, looking at power structures, power dynamics as they exist across a whole wide set of arenas. Critical race theory, post-structural theory, gender theory, environmentalist critical theory, critical disability theory, Marxism, of course, feminist theory, all of these different bodies and branches of theory looking to excavate, locate, and deconstruct and critique existing systems of power in this world that we live in, and come up with radical ways to shift those dynamics and move them around. So a critical approach to interpersonal communication is a burgeoning subfield within the interpersonal communication discipline. It's relatively new. Interpersonal communication as a subfield, as a body of research, has traditionally been overwhelmingly very what we call positivistic or post-positivistic, functionalist and interpretivist. I'm not going to get into all of that today because it doesn't matter for this conversation. In short, it's not been a body of work that has centralized and even recognized the ways in which power exists in this world. Social, cultural hierarchies exist in this world, and how that really does impact our relationships and our interpersonal comm. We are now facing and experiencing a bit of a turning point in the discipline, thankfully, where we are starting to understand the connection between our interpersonal comm and larger systems of inequity and how they mutually inform each other. So I approach this study from a critical interpersonal perspective, where I see relationships as, to borrow from Mikhail Bakhtin, who is a Russian philosopher and theorist, ideologically situated, meaning that our relationships, they are not removed from the larger ideologies that exist in this world. And in fact, they are sites that are both targets of those ideologies and that reproduce and perpetuate them. I was also looking at what Michel Foucault, another famous post-structural critical theorist, calls tiny everyday practices. What are the tiny everyday things in our lives that are very arbitrary to us, that are seemingly banal and meaningless, that in fact are very meaningful, that are very, very meaningful? Something as simple as when you wash the dishes and you remove your wedding band because you don't want it to get lost or messed up. In that moment, you are essentially reasserting the signification of this wedding band, and therefore sort of revitalizing and reestablishing and purporting the power of the institution of marriage, even if there's not any direct consequences or outcomes of that placement on the windowsill while you wash dishes. In doing so, that is a tiny practice that, in your concerted effort to remove and place down, symbolically, you are reasserting the forcefulness that the institution of marriage and all of the ideologies surrounding that has in your life, and therefore you are perpetuating it. So it's taking relationships from a more critical perspective and more deeply examining the behaviors within them. Broadly, critical interpersonal communication is invested in looking at connections between the more macro, so the systemic, the structural, the more broad bird's eye view of society as it's made up of all of these moving parts, and the micro. The micro being our everyday relationships, things on the ground, so to speak, which is really what my project has been focused on. The micro being the relationships of Trump supporters that happen in private among one or two members, a couple of members, and larger systems, larger structures, the democratic system, the political system, the structuration of the presidency, of gender as evidenced through the presidency. It sees communication as discursively produced and influenced in relationships as such, that relationships are shaped, and how we understand what our relationships are and what they should be, what our expectations for relationships are influenced highly by existing discourse, telling us what we should expect from those relationships. There's also a conflation between the public and the private spheres, meaning that what we do in our private lives has a direct sort of influence on the public, and vice versa. And that is an approach and an assumption that harkens back to the second wave of feminism's mantra, the personal is political. If we think about our private life, the fact that, for example, women have for so long been expected to remain in the private sphere and do this silenced, unpaid work of home maintenance, right? Cooking, cleaning, keeping up the children, taking them to practice for this and that, whatever. That is the private sphere, but there is a deep connection between those private interactions and expectations and roles and responsibilities and labor and the relationships that constitute those family dynamics, and larger public policy and discourses surrounding women, women's rights, women's inherent value, the pay discrepancy between men and women, etc. Also, as with most other critical theory, critical interpersonal comm has a political lean. It is sort of inherently, overtly, and unapologetically political in the sense that it takes to task larger figureheads and institutions that disenfranchise people. And it seeks a revisiting and a restructuring of those inadequacies and inequities. So it has a social justice orientation. So that brings me to the findings of my work and sort of where we're going here. I do want to briefly talk about one other thing that I use to help frame how I approached the study and the findings and how I analyzed the behaviors of the men in the study. Anthony Giddens' structuration theory, or theory of structuration, it comes out of sociology. And what this theory is really looking at is those connections between micro, everyday behaviors and more macro systems and structures, hence the name structuration. And this theory is really understanding how it is that we create larger systemic structural formations through our everyday behavior and performances. So how is it that structures, which always work as a tool to grant privileges to some while restricting the power of others, such as, for the intents and purposes of this project, women and feminine-oriented citizens and subjects. Giddens articulates that systems are patterned in and through time and space through what he refers to as continuities of social reproduction. So very similar to Judith Butler's notion of citationality, that we reproduce gender with each new time that we cite an existing moment or performance of gender. So by me, for example, wearing this button-up shirt, which is of course associated with maleness and masculinity, which I learned these cues from somewhere else, from all over the place, was taught this. When I put this shirt on, I am in essence citationally reproducing the associations of a professional aesthetic for males in a professional context. So continuities of social reproduction is trying to understand how is it that through reproducing this, doing this time and time again, does it reproduce a larger system of inequity that disadvantages some and advantages others. A big part relevant for this theory and for this project specifically is that systems are comprised of both rules and resources. That is to say, there are things that we draw upon, such as a shirt in a menial way, to aid in sustaining that production of gender. But the reason I see this shirt as a resource to establish my masculine gender is partially because of a set of rules that tell me that this is something that I should see as a resource to establishing my gender. So something, when we talk about rules, it is a prescription in which we are to follow. It is something that we have been told. We might call it a script. We talk about social scripts a lot, gender scripts. Scripting theory broadly is what this is called. Where is it that we are taught rules? Socialization, for example, gender socialization. Where are we taught the rules that we are taught to survive in this world, but then that constitute larger systems and structures? And what are the rules that we draw upon to help us follow those rules to survive and to successfully navigate and negotiate this sort of nexus, which then in turn reproduces the larger system? So another thing relevant is that actors communicate and behave in ways that either reward or sanction actions. So in essence, either continuing or halting behaviors that are part of or potentially part of the broader systemic norms. So we do things in essence that we try to follow rules, right? Because we are rewarded when we follow rules. We are not punished. And so we behave in ways that either we become penalized and scrutinized, or awarded, or at the very least, allowed to continue to survive. So when we talk about this in the context of gender, for example, am I outright rewarded by wearing this shirt? Well, I'm not bullied for wearing this shirt. There are no consequences for me as a male-identified, biologically male-bodied person putting this shirt on and walking down the street. Whereas if I put on, let's say, a dress, which of course in terms of clothes serves the same function. It does not leave my body bare, but because of the cultural symbolics and ascriptions that we have to a dress, we associate with womanhood, and we live in a society where men dressing as women has always been seen as a site of consternation and humor. Then I would be sanctioned in some way. Either I would be called out, I would be interpolated, to use the language of Louis Althusser. I would be interpolated and made a new type of subject, a shameful subject. And then it would encourage me to not do that again. And of course, when we are sanctioned, it encourages us to not do that sanction again, which then not only restores, but maintains the larger order. So how does that play out in the relationships of the male friendships here? And all of this is to say is that the relationship between our behavior and our language and larger social systems is very circulatory, very mutually informing. Giddens writes that the recursive character of language, and by generalization of social systems also, cannot be understood unless we also understand that the means whereby such systems are reproduced and thus exist as systems contain within them the seeds of change, which is to say, these things are mutually informing. System and action are mutually informing, and we cannot change the system until we look at the action, but we can also not really anticipate significant change in our actions until we understand the systems that predict and guide and encourage the behaviors that we are engaging in our acting. So all of this culminates this very recursive nature for Giddens in what is called the duality of structure, the conterminous co-constitutive nature of both actor and social system, the ways that they are inherently intertwined, entangled, enmeshed with one another. And so for Giddens, this is a very important part of structuration theory. In order for any of these observations and analysis to be useful, you have to figure out what that duality of structure is. What is a particular thing that is serving as both rule and resource that is causing and reproducing both structural or systemic norms and situated action norms? And that is a hard part. But for this particular project, I have established what I believe to be one example of a communicative-oriented duality of structure. And I will talk about that here in just a moment. last little bit, I want to give just a very, very brief review of male friendships in general in terms of it relating to the current project. So masculinity, again, going on this post-structural notion that gender is socially brought to life, co-constructed in many ways. Masculinity itself is a fabrication and a contextual thing of a particular historical moment. What it means to be a man shifts from decade to decade, from era to era. And part of that is influenced by who we have in political power. What it means to be a man in 2020 is very different from what it meant to be a man 300 years ago. And right now, in the COVID crisis, we are seeing a lot of men in the United States have to come to terms with and come to recognition with their own understandings of what it means to be a man as it relates to wearing a mask, and sort of publicly recognizing and acknowledging your own vulnerability through the symbolic performance of wearing a mask. So masculinity broadly is kind of is influenced by ideology that is constructed through both myth. So we hear these stories about what it means to be a man that are passed down in this sort of mythological ethos kind of way. Image, the symbolic image of what it means to be a man, aesthetically, symbolically, textually. Discourse, the ways in which we talk about what it means to be a man and how we bring that to life publicly. And then, of course, practice or behaviors. There are three primary phenomena that correlate homosociality to masculinity, to hegemonic masculinity. Again, homosociality being the behavior and process and practice of people of the same sex socially engaging with one another in a platonic sense. So, and this is by Bird and one of her in a very landmark study from 1996. So she says that these are the three phenomena that correlate these two things. One, emotional detachment. So at the young age, when boys sort of detach themselves from their moms and other feminine persons, which in turn gives them this idea that men are inexpressive or should be inexpressive and resist emotional intimacy, because they are weaning themselves from the mother in this sort of nurturing caregiver kind of role. Second, competitiveness, that homosocial bonds act as a playing ground to express and articulate a competitive spirit. And then third, the objectification of women in homosocial circles, where male epistemologies, which is essentially ways of knowing, and male ontologies, or notions of reality, what it means to be in the world and what realities are considered not only different from women's, but superior. So common sense for a man. What men talk a lot about, this rhetoric of common sense, and that women don't have common sense. So we see this idea that men develop, that not only do they have unique and different ways of knowing and understandings of reality than their female gender counterparts, but superior ways of knowing. And that's very important. Gender socialization is also a big thing here, that where people sort of quote unquote learn to do gender, where men develop language patterns among one another early on and continuously, where they rely on blunt, crude, and sexual kind of themes, which work to legitimize masculinity. Going back to this idea of rule and resource, and engaging in ways that either reward or sanction behavior. Men pick up on these codes and they see that they are rewarded for relying on these behaviors within their same-sex friendships groups. Men's friendships have also generally been characterized as being more activities-based rather than communication-based, such as disclosures or having a communication of closeness, where they build closeness through skill sets and activities rather than talk. Having displays of common interests, shared activities are oftentimes, again, the ways that men develop friendships. Straight men develop friendships with one another. In terms of conversational topics, men have been shown to focus more on topics relating to status and power and competitive practices, and also other research talking about, the more focus on professional or skills-based things rather than more emotional things relating to their personal lives. And then relevant for this studies, we'll talk about male bonding. A very relevant and significant practice within it is that of jokes. telling jokes, using humor, and we'll get a bit more into that. So, lastly, about the method of me doing this study, my participant profiles. To be a member of this study, you needed to be male identified, Caucasian, between the ages of 18 and 27, and self-identify as a Trump supporter. Not Trump voter, Trump supporter, because at the time of the election in 2016, some of my participants, many of whom were college students, could not legally vote. They weren't old enough to vote. So, and I was also really interested in seeing what this sort of current generation, the younger generation, how they are coming into their own selves as young men. Because there's a huge difference between approaching this from an 18-year-old's perspective and a 50-year-old's perspective. Both are valuable, but they are so different that to put them in conversation, unless you were going to do a study on the similarities and differences of those two, wouldn't work. So I wanted to focus on younger Trump supporters. I had a total of 10 participants so far. And I did qualitative methodologies for this, so it was not surveys or anything like that. It was qualitative. I did interviews with the participants ranging from about 45 minutes to an hour and a half with each of the participants, where we interviewed and recorded the interviews. And I had an interview guide with lots of different questions. The interview guide was broken up into 3 primary sections of questions. So the first was questions on Trump. So their general opinions on specific moments through Trump's campaign, through his presidency, focusing specifically on his behaviors and his communication style. Second round of questions was on their perspectives on a range of political issues, socio-political issues. So the Me Too movement, the Women's March of 2017, Trump's grab her by the pussy comments, which, sorry for using that word, but I'm taking it from context from our president's mouth. Talking about racial issues, immigration issues, the wall, etc. And then lastly, a round of questions focusing on the relational norms and interpersonal communication behavior within their friendships. And there I did categorizing and coding of transcript data to find themes emergent within the data that then I could use for analysis and build my theorations from. So the overall results of the study. So we go back to this Anthony Giddens idea of the duality of structure, this particular thing that serves as the source of this recursive relationship between structure and action, between rules and resources that people both follow and draw from. And within my data set, this idea of compartmentalizing became really, really prominent, really salient very quickly in terms of how my participants engaged in their personal social worlds as well as the more broader socio-cultural world. And so I developed this idea of commutative compartmentalization to really articulate and get at this strategy. And this strategy builds on existing communication theories and concepts such as code switching, coordinated management of meaning, and communication accommodation theory, as well as building from psychological and neurological approaches to compartmentalization, which emphasize this sort of tension or this dialectic between social, emotional, sexual, and cognitive integration and segregation. When we think about compartmentalizing, it's the sequestering, right? Keeping things apart. Psychologically, we do it for many reasons. From a communication standpoint, we can think about it in terms of modifying or changing the way that we speak and act and behave, compartmentalizing certain ideas or ideologies and the communicative act of articulating those in certain spaces among certain groups and sort of the implications of doing that. And that it became very obvious that this idea of compartmentalizing behavior was something that was used in various ways. The two most prominent ones is communicative compartmentalization, acting as both a rule to follow for social protection in what the participants perceived as a hyper-PC world, so that they would not face social sanction, but then also as a resource to draw upon to also prevent that sanction, but also as a resource to draw upon in their personal lives to intensify emotional connection among their friends. So in this sense, compartmentalization worked as both an interpersonal act to draw upon and a more macro-oriented analytic filter to apply. So compartmentalizing one's own behaviors and assessing the behaviors of others through this compartmentalist lens. So we can see that they compartmentalize at both a micro and meso and macro level. And we see this in other groups as well. So like LGBT men, for example, compartmentalizing their queer identity at various levels. You can compartmentalize it at a micro level or the intrapsychic level between yourself and your own psychological space. You can compartmentalize your queer identity between yourself and certain friends, or between all of your friends, or between your family, where you compartmentalize it and they don't know about that part of your life. And then from a more macro systemic level, where you compartmentalize your queer identity, let's say from political decisions you make, or other decisions you make that are a more structural level domain. So how do the participants compartmentalize and use compartmentalization as an analytic framework to assess the behaviors of others? So relevant for Trump, when I was interested in the question of how did you continue to support Trump in spite of all of these things that he's done that so many people of us find infuriating and worrisome, there was this ongoing theme of the ability to compartmentalize his behaviors in ways that in turn permissed them. They did not sanction them. Participants described him as straightforward, blunt, no bullshitter, consistent, honest, sincere, authentic, forthright, having fortitude, and so on. And one of the ways that they came to this conclusion is because they were able to dismiss a lot of his behaviors. And so I have here on this screen some of the ways that some of the themes and ways that they were able to dismiss and compartmentalize. So the role of context and the role of a leader, for example. And so they were able to differentiate Trump's behavior from what particular role he had, for example, as potential political candidate versus official candidate versus president. And based on where he was at in those roles, they extended a more or less severe sort of sanction of those behaviors or opinions of those behaviors. And that was sort of closely related to timing, which goes into this compartmentalizing the campaign of before or after the campaign. So he seemed to get a pass on a lot of things that he'd done before the campaign versus after. So like the grab her by the pussy comment, that was done in 2005, and that was prior to his desire to be sort of this public servant of the president. So because his intentions were different at that time, his behavior should be assessed very differently accordingly. And then another way that he was compartmentalized and assessed through that process of compartmentalization was through his celebrity status. Seeing him as a celebrity distinguished and compartmentalized from his role as president or potential president. And so they would excuse or justify many of his behaviors, equating it with just the shenanigans of a celebrity, which in turn positioned Hollywood not as a nefarious institution full of troubling, power-hungry people, such as like Harvey Weinstein, for example, or Bill Cosby, but as this sort of innocent, lighthearted, family-friendly industry where there is no way that people in that industry could perform or behave badly in real life. And if they were, then they're just being eccentric Hollywood stars. And so all of these different strategies to compartmentalize, whether it was before, after the campaign, before, after his presidency, before, after him being a celebrity, etc., worked to sort of give him a pass and therefore sort of perpetuate and legitimize the behavior that they are passing, right? Now, in terms of the micro, how is it that they were able to compartmentalize, and in what ways were they compartmentalizing among themselves in their personal friendships? So I found that men, conservative men right now, younger ones, they compartmentalize their behaviors to both facilitate closeness with some and protect themselves from others. And I want to be very clear here. One of the things that came up in every single interview that I did was this perception that we are living in an increasingly hyper-vigilantly PC, politically correct culture that is under surveillance, that is the liberal left's tyrannical assault on the sort of public sphere and the private sphere. And so a lot of the behaviors from these men are driven by this sort of political and cultural direction that we have taken. And so that is one place where we see a very clear connection between larger public discourses and micro interactions. So in a world that they perceive as being hypersensitive, hyper politically correct, for these men, things like intentionality is really important. Word choice is really important. They were all very vocal about their frustrations with the notion that impact is more important than intentionality. This debate we're seeing right now, it's a more feminist liberal perspective, which is it's not so much what you meant by what was said, but how it was interpreted that matters. And I have my own critiques of the emphasis on impact versus intentionality. And in fact, this is one of the places that I found myself agreeing with a lot of my participants. And that can be for another talk, but I did see some overlaps between my own opinions with these issues and this. So for these men, there was a clear distinction between thought and action. And it was an understanding, a recognition, mutual understanding of that thought and action that distinguished that was really important for these men in developing trust and intimacy in their friendships. So satisfying or satisfactory friendships occurs for these men by the knowledge that everyday talk meanings lie much more in how and when something was said rather than what was said. And this goes back to Anthony Giddens' idea of mutual knowledges, that for a pattern to become persistent and sort of integrate itself in the larger social structure and start to shape it and constitute it, we have to have a mutual set of knowledges to bring this to life and to reproduce it. And this was also a huge lens for how men interpreted the grab her by the pussy commentary, which they were, they referred to as kind of just shooting the shit, this sort of locker room talk that you would see and experience. And so again, it's very important to note that this is highly influenced from a larger perception of a cultural tyranny sort of happening, and that compartmentalized behavior within their friendships of saying what they want, saying offensive things, saying jokes, and I will talk more specifically about what kind of things they really say here in a second. That was really a marker of intimacy and closeness in the current political arena. And this is relevant because it's telling us that the current socio-political atmosphere and environment is really shaping new ways of how people are thinking what it means to be intimate and how to be intimate. The men also engaged in something that I call compartmentalized ambivalence. So this sort of simultaneous ability to both disavow sexist behaviors while rationalizing them or shirking responsibility for them. Because again, if it's this, it's not what you say, it's how you say it. It's intention, not impact. Or if it's thought or it's action that matters and not thought, you're able to simultaneously say, well, you shouldn't have said that, but you didn't mean anything by, and nothing came of it, so it doesn't really matter. So this kind of ambiguous or ambivalent, really, approach to compartmentalization, which was something that all of the men sort of really expressed. And in doing so, this idea of intention, what you meant, rather than how it was impacted, that is sort of transmorgified into a sense of authenticity and relatability, which if we connect those understandings to something like intention, to Trump, it becomes very clear then that his acts of bullying or his moments and thoughts or tweets that are egregious or seemingly mean-spirited, this ability in their friendships to recognize the importance of intentionality and word choice and how and where and when something was said rather than the outcome, and that being a source of intimacy and authenticity and relatability, it becomes very clear then how those things become coalesced with and translated into an understanding of Trump as being relatable and authentic. One of the biggest ways that the men sort of do this in their everyday is through insult humor with each other. And here, I'm not going to go into this for the sake of time very much, but here on the screen you can see some of the general characteristics or relationships between gender and humor. There's this idea that humor, especially insult humor, is for men and that women aren't funny. This picture here is a screen grab of a documentary called Women Aren't Funny, which sort of outlines the historical tendency for men and men's humor to be seen as paramount, but women is just not being funny. That humor is a male enterprise. And so there are a lot of gendered elements to humor. And it's something that oftentimes gets overlooked. And it became clear that men in this study used humor, insult humor specifically, as both a rule and a resource to follow and draw upon for various purposes to achieve different ends. So the first is using humor, insult humor, as a way to perform gender in and of itself, as a mode of masculine affirmation within their friendships. Crawford in 2003 wrote that humor is certainly not the most important way people do gender, but neither is it insignificant. And so this begs the question of how is it that we perform and enact humor to establish our gender, whether you're feminine, masculine, non-conforming, male-identified, female-identified. What is that correlation between your gender and your forms of humor? So for example, we know that queer men, specifically gay men, have been troublingly and not all accurately conceptualized as having a more witty, sharp, sometimes catty sense of humor. And that being sort of part of the makeup of the stereotype of the gay man. But if we look at that, humor is used by gay men. Oftentimes it's a tool of resistance developed early on in response to bullying. And so it's not that gay men are just necessarily born hilarious, although we may be. I don't know. But it also is a tool that is brought on by social conditions that necessitate those tools to defend ourselves in the social sort of landscape. For the men in the present study, insult humor was really, really central for their own establishment of gender, insult humor specifically, to, in the language of several of the men, this idea of to see if you could take it, of not getting butt hurt, where reception of a joke or the jab is not seen as emasculating, but something that showcases an endurance. You know, it's kind of a counter response or a counter discourse to heteronormative discourses of sexuality, where penetration, being able to take it or taking it, is seen as passive, right? Heteronormative discourses see the passive partner or subject, the person who takes it, as a complete antithesis to power and masculinity itself. But this idea of endurance here, in taking the jab, showing it, showcases a form of domination of masculinity. And so insulting is really central to being a man here. And the relationship itself between the men offered a space for them to sort of develop and flex the muscles of this sort of masculine trait. Because if you break down insult humor, especially as it's understood as something you throw back and forth to see if you can take it, to not get hurt, it really relies on and perpetuates a lot of very hyper-masculine characteristics, such as competition, agility, assertiveness, impenetrability, ego, etc. And so it kind of gives a space to communicatively sharpen those tools with each other in the relationship to make that known and to perpetuate that. So in that sense, you are relying on particular types of rules to follow in terms of what kind of humor is appropriate for men, but you're also using those forms of humor as a resource to build your own brand of masculinity, both within and beyond that relationship. So I note that to compartmentalize insult humor, because that's what it is. Insult humor is something that is really specific to male-male homosocial friendships most of the time. It's not something that these men do with their female friends, or if they do insult humor with their female friends, it's done in a very different way. I would describe it with their male friends as being more authentic, more raw, really, less diluted. And so that's where you might sort of see the most authentic, sincere form of the capacities of masculine insult. And so in this, therefore, it is compartmentalized within the relationship. And it's a unique mode of masculine performance that downplays the significance or implications of those utterances at the interactional level and potentially beyond the parameters of the relationship itself. So a critical question, and from a critical theory perspective, is to ask the inquiry, well, what are the possible implications of that micro performance on larger macro structures, where we are sort of, again, flexing the muscles of these more negative components of hypermasculinity or hegemonic masculinity? How does that infiltrate beyond or transgress the relational boundaries there to something else? How does it work to reproduce larger macro privileges that are afforded to masculine subjects and the sort of characteristics associated with them? And I'll get to that here in just a moment. Another thing that the men did, more specifically for the insult humor, is what I call interactional and systemic othering. And so when we talk about othering, it's this idea of intentionally and strategically creating out-group and in-group identities, of creating us versus them sensibilities, where you're stigmatizing the them and centralizing the us, right? And so there are lots of different ways that this happens. But it was interesting that the men treated othering sort of as a game. And so I call this interactional othering. And so it happens in two distinct yet sort of disparate sort of ways and at different levels here. So interactional and inclusionary othering is a mode of othering that the men employed and deployed that was in fact inclusionary for one another, where they dismiss and denigrate and attack and distinguish from each other, but it's in a way that is playful. And it's done through a lexicon of aspersive language and exclusionary behavior, where you're bringing each other down, you're being mean to each other, you're essentially really bullying each other, but they're done in jest. And there's no serious consequences between the friendships because it is understood that it is not to be taken seriously. Because again, going back to the compartmentalized thing, it's just words and the intention is not to hurt, it's to be playful. It's a game where social actors can participate, which then works to strengthen ties and build intimacy there. And so those processes and performances of othering, they create camaraderie and solidarity among its sort of exclusive members. They playfully other one another using these different kinds of harsh language that denigrates each other, that brings each other down a peg. But again, they know that they're not really being brought down a peg. They don't have a law at stake here to be lost, which is really important. They have the privilege and luxury to knock each other down because they're not really bullied and knocked down elsewhere outside of the confines of that relationship. So this idea of bullying for them is really not to be taken seriously. It's not used as a catalyst for aggression or violence. It is something that is to be dismissed as inconsequential because they really, by and largely, don't experience it elsewhere. And so for them, bullying is playful. And again, in doing so, it confirms and confers a masculine ethos that is in many ways defined by endurance, power, and bravado. But what this does is that what we need to think about is what are the implications beyond that relationship for that othering. If it embraces and strengthens bravado and endurance and competitiveness and sharpens the blade of meanness, mean-spiritedness, even if within that relational parameter it's not to be taken seriously, how can it be used negatively beyond the relationship? And that's where I talk about what I call systemic level exclusionary othering, where that process of othering relationally worked to be inclusive of a particular group of people. When applied outside of it, it works to exclude large groups of people. So it translates into exclusion. And so then that resource that they use and that rule that they follow relationally then acts as kind of a resource for larger structural gatekeeping. So, for example, things like humor in the professional world are valued statistically, empirically, are seen to be valued by and among male bosses, but not women. women and women's humor is not valued, excuse me, in the same way that men's humor is in the workplace. And so again, we see this connection where that othering, that playfulness in relationships, men eventually not only get a pass for, oftentimes in professional organizations, but get rewarded for, and women get sanctioned for doing. So those relational practices really work as a resource there and a rule to follow, but eventually a rule and resource beyond that relationship. And again, think about the values and the characteristics necessitated by and born out of this ongoing exchange of insults and jabs. Again, competitiveness, assertiveness, agility, endurance, confidence, dismissiveness. All of these are skill sets that within a patriarchal world are seen as very, very important and useful in ascending the political, economic career ladder. And if we're valuing and teaching those kinds of things to boys and to enact them in their friendships, again, we are giving young men an advance, a leg up, and we are stigmatizing women for doing the same thing. And so that is where the sort of connection exists, this sort of duality of structure. And if we want to talk about, inequality between the sexes, the genders, there's really not you're not going to find a lack of areas to find, to look to evidence that. I have here just a couple of things where we can talk about inequity or inequality. We've got labor practices and economics. So the wage gap between women and men is still over 18%. Here you'll see this chart, and it's an intersectional kind of approach. We're looking at the wage gap between women and men as it is raced. So we've got white women, black women, Hispanic women, juxtaposed against white men, black men, and Hispanic men. And so there, we talk about women's disadvantaged status in the workforce and in the career space, and connecting those interactional behaviors that men engage in their friendships and how they can be used as a valuable resource in sustaining this inequality right here. We also know that most support-based jobs are still performed by women and refuse to be performed by men. So what is the connection between that refusal to for men to refuse to do support-based jobs and keeping women in those roles, and this ongoing relational practice among men to engage in competition and trying to outdo one another and enhance and intensify those skills, and in no way are based on support, right? So that's something else to think about. The second way that insult humor is used, the sort of end result is to create intimacy. So the first being to perform masculinity in of itself. The second way is to express closeness and intimacy with their friendships. So it's a communicative rather than activities approach to connection. And here, insult humor kind of functions as a lubricant for social intimacy that encourage open communication while preventing vulnerability. And it compartmentalizes and produces a set of logics where successful interpretation of jokes, of insulting jabs, of mean-spirited exchanges connotes intimacy. And here, men would use phrases like ball busting as a way to demonstrate this playful, ongoing way of showing compassion and care for one another. Versus, if you think about the flip side of this, men oftentimes referring to women doing these sorts of things as nagging. So from, again, a critical perspective, breaking that down a little bit and thinking about how it is when other men do it, it's playful ball busting. When women do it, it's nagging. And that there alone sort of shores up and reveals a lot of the misogynistic tendencies that animate and populate these behaviors. One of my participants said, you know, if I don't give you crap, it means I probably don't like you. And so again, this idea of offensive humor, which is coded as a bonding mechanism, especially in a PC culture, was seen as a sign of closeness because it ensured a sign of trust. It was compartmentalized. If you could engage in insulting, offensive humor with each other, say nasty things to each other, it meant that you were in a space that was removed from the hyper PC softies elsewhere. And it sort of created trust, and in that trust built intimacy with each other. And then it created a sense of an authentic self with you and among your friends. And again, I think very clearly then we can see how this relational norm of equating insults and humor and off-color humor to intimacy and authenticity and care, it becomes very clear how that practice then translates as a lens of analysis or assessment for Trump and what he says, and the off-color PC, non-PC things that he says. To many people, that showcases an inability to have any sort of decorum or compassion or care. For these people, it is something to be laughed at, to be joked at, and it's something that connotes authenticity, and that in of itself is an ethics of care, because out of that care comes intentionality and an authentic performance above all else. The second thing beyond relational humor that I found the men to engage in was a reconceptualization of the locker room talk. So Trump very notoriously brought locker room talk back into mainstream discourse because when it was revealed that he had the grab him by the pussy comment, you know, he wrote it all off and boiled it down to it's just locker room talk. And so that brought up a lot of conversations about, well, what is locker room talk and what is the locker room? And so I'm not going to get too much into this because of time, but there's, you know, historically the locker room has been associated obviously with the athletic sphere. Curry wrote that the men's locker room is enshrined in sports mythology as a bastion of privilege and a center of fraternal bonding. So it is a very important, significant site of homosocial bonding, the locker room, both metaphorically and literally. Men's talk and fraternal bonding generally responds to and sustains 4 discourses of masculinity, including dominance, gender difference, heterosexism, and male solidarity. And so the locker room is a really important place, or really any sort of sequestered place for men. It does not have to be a locker room, of course. A very important place for men to respond to and perpetuate those discourses. And so in my research here, locker room talk was defined by one, a need for momentary gender separation that facilitates closeness through language itself, and then something that acted as a shared knowledge, again, going back to that notion from structuration theory, that masculine recuperation is needed in the form of male-only private spaces, or mostly male-only private spaces. This idea of recuperation is really, really important right now for these young men in the era of the hyper PC cancel culture woke battles. Very important. Men talked about how locker room talk now, they had adopted it among their friends. Some of them had even text groups that were called locker room talk, you know, on their cell phones. And that once Trump sort of articulated this idea again, it became really central and became sort of this movement almost where locker room talk is now not really associated with athleticism. It is more associated with a hyper PC culture. And there's an added dimension to it now where it's not so much just about building a solidarity of men and having a recuperation of masculinity. It acts as a recuperation to the exhaustion men feel living in a world that many would just simply perceive as holding them accountable. And again, that's a different conversation or a different day. These men kind of saw locker room talk and locker room spaces as a symbolic safe space where social decorum could be transgressed. And it's interesting, of course, because a lot of these people are the very ones who lambast and make fun of the notion of a safe space as we see it now on college campuses and whatever, and refer to the people who need them as snowflakes because they're softies and they take everything so seriously and they're oversensitive. But the men described locker room talk kind of as like going to therapy or letting out bottled up things or as a release. So it's this very cathartic homosocial engagement that is compartmentalized not only from the larger public sphere, but also other audiences. Some of them did speak about it being primarily for men, but then others said that no, anyone could be involved in locker room talk, because locker room talk now again wasn't based on sexism or overtly sexual talk or sexualizing and objectifying women. It was more so a rallying fierce critique against the PC culture, which is really, really interesting, I think. And again, kind of just illustrates how the connection between larger cultural regimes and norms are deeply impacting the way that we do friendships and the way that we devise intimacy within those friendships. So I want to just close, offer some closing remarks on this talk. I thank you all for listening. It's went a little longer than I was planning for it to, but I do thank you for, if you stuck through it, I do appreciate it. We're in a very different time right now. We've been in a very different time for the past 4 or 5 years, politically, culturally, democratically. We're in a very divided time, a polarized time, and Trump has certainly been a figure of division, and I think has relied upon and sparked division, and in many ways fetishizes it and tries to use it for his own advantages. But I think that Trump's ascension and what that means is something that is much deeper than this moment, and it's something that is going to have lasting impact, because it doesn't begin and end with Trump. I think one of the things that the liberal left is going to have to do is really take a long and hard look at themselves and their political policies and the culture that they have created, this self-righteous, holier than thou, hyper woke, hyper PC, cancel culture, what I call the hall monitor syndrome, this idea of going around and trying to call out everything that you see as bad, and thinking about all of the rhetorics and logics that they use to sustain their rationality, such as the impact versus intention, which essentially robs any person but oneself of any agency and autonomy and how to articulate their perspective, because it's a very individualistic approach to saying it doesn't matter what you said or think, it's what I matter, I. And until the left, I think, really gets serious with itself and takes a hard look at itself and understands how it is really contributing to the rise of Trump and his movement, and that again, it's going to have ripple effects, and it's not going to end with Trump's term ending, whether that's now or 4 years from now. The culture that the left, I'm going to include myself in this, we've created is one that has given rise to a very particular set of concerns and relational responses to those concerns and acting out of and within and because of those concerns. And we're going to have to figure out a way to move forward so that we work across party lines, so that our own behaviors, our own ideologies aren't necessitating a movement that develops and builds a locker room talk as the space where people can go and just unleash. And that's where things can get tricky. If we force people to go into these secluded spaces and let out things and then circulate those ideologies, only for them to grow at this sort of in this consciousness raising way, we're going to have a much bigger problem years from now than what we have right now. So we need to take accountability of that. This project has really shown, I think, the connections between gender, how we do gender, larger structures and systems of inequality, of patriarchy, for example, and how our own everyday micro-relational practices influence and are influenced by those things. Specific to the current moment we're in and young conservatives who see something of themselves in Trump and who see Trump in themselves, I think there's a lot to be said and learned there. And, there's a lot of concern over this perceived tyranny and infringement over rights and the ways in which those rights are being resisted in everyday performances. And right now, you know, we've got COVID happening, and one of the things that's just not being talked about enough, again, in my opinion, is the role that gender is playing in this anti-mask movement that we're seeing right now. There's an assumption that a lot of masculinity is under threat or under siege right now, and that young men are sort of fuming because of that, and they're having to release these things elsewhere, and it's popping up in their friendships and the way that they do friendships, and this very bizarre tendency to not wear a mask because Donald Trump has again deeply sowed the seeds of suspension of science in this country among his supporters and of authority figures that aren't him. We are seeing a very particular performance of masculinity right now that is once again refuting this hyper PC, liberal, all-encompassing, all-seeing, all-watching culture perceived. And so I think it's important that we continue to center gender and understand its role between something like not wearing a mask. How is it that wearing a mask is, for some men, seen as chipping away at their masculinity itself because it's implying vulnerability, susceptibility, and you know, you put that into conversation with it being an attack on our freedom of speech or our rights. And again, that kind of rhetoric and that response was very much the same response that I saw from a lot of my participants in terms of their everyday life now. And so they're using things like more insult humor among one another within their friendships to connote intimacy and closeness and authenticity and to build the muscles of their masculinity as a response to that. And so we are seeing this conflation between what is perceived as an attack on democracy and our freedoms as Americans and men's sort of understanding of self and their gender. And I don't really have all of the answers right now, but I think these are important questions that we must sort of keep asking for ourselves. These are important questions that we must keep asking for ourselves. And as we move into the future, and again, I don't have all the answers, but these are important things we need to be looking at and understanding in a more deep way rather than simply throwing mud at one another. Culture is changing. Our democracy is changing, whether or not we always like that, the ways that it's changing, but those changes are also shaping what we're doing in our relationships and our friendships. And what we're doing in our friendships and our relationships among one another is shaping how we understand larger systems and culture and how we anticipate or desire changes from them as well. So I want to leave on that note. I thank you all for listening today. I hope you found this interesting, and have a good rest of the year. 2020 has not been great. Have a good rest of the year. Happy election.